this is not the same as my rod dryer. This is my rod dryer setup, and it uses a very low RPM, and it's a 120 volt, but it's a 10 to 12 RPM motor that runs off AC voltage. And I've just got some adjustability here from these feet. This high density polyethylene is tapped and threaded for these adjustable feet. And on the bottoms of these, I've got some of that clear Gorilla Glue on there that I showed you that can be used on guide wraps because it's just a little tacky. It's not quite as slick as epoxy. So it's got a little bit of rubbery tackiness to it that helps keep that from sliding around. And of course, I've got my baby bottle chuck on here. And one cool thing is I can switch from, this is what I call my finishing motor that I use with my wrapping jig. I can switch from my finishing motor where I'm applying finish to the rod dryer just without ever removing the blank. My blank would still be in this baby bottle setup, and I'd just switch over to my dryer and tighten that on to my dryer and turn it on, and then it's spinning on the same stands that I use to do the finishing and the wrapping both. So this is a real simple setup. It's easy to duplicate. In fact, my adjustable feet on this one were made from just some threaded rod. I drilled holes into these wooden dowels and epoxied the threaded rod into these and set it flat while I was allowing the epoxy to dry. And that allowed for a level finished unit then. And once that epoxy had dried on these dowels, they were stuck to those rods. Now I can adjust those feet up and down just by using those dowels. And you can see if I get those out of whack, how tippy it gets. But I can adjust the height of this depending on what I'm doing. You've got some adjustability with feet built like that. Now this is a 200 RPM DC gear motor. And you'll see that the shaft on this motor itself is not built to high tolerances. It wiggles in there quite a bit, which is okay. It's not hurting anything at all. I just wanted to mention that if you were looking at those. And the same goes for these dryer motors. They wobble around a lot too. They're not real tight tolerances on those motors as far as the output shafts go, because they're usually used to turn something that doesn't have to be on a direct plane. That flexibility won't hurt anything. By using these baby bottle chucks, like I showed you how to build on another video, and I'll put a link to that up here in the top right hand corner as well. There's a lot of flexibility in this part. If you've got it backed off to where you can use this finishing motor and use this baby bottle as a slip clutch like that, see how this output shaft's not turning, but the bottle is spinning on this screw that runs through it. So what I can do now is run this at 200 RPMs. I can apply my epoxy and stop my rod with my fingers and move the epoxy around underneath the guides and things like that. Make sure I've got epoxy down the tunnels. And it really makes finishing a whole lot easier. And I honestly believe you get less bubbles when you apply the epoxy at a high rate of speed. Now you can get the bubbles out regardless. It's not impossible to get bubbles out, but I think you've got less initially when you're applying the epoxy at a high rate of speed with very slight pressure with the brush. It seems like the bubbles just pop on their own for the most part doing that. So this is a 12 volt DC motor, and you can buy these motors and you can buy these mounts for them. And all I've done was mount that to a block to get it to the height that I need to work in conjunction with my rod stand. I've thought about selling these as an add-on or an additional part for people that bought these wrapping jigs from me. I don't know if there'd be enough demand. The cost of it would be pretty significant and probably pretty close to the cost of the wrapping jig. There's a cost associated with buying baby bottles that have these bigger nipples like that. They're not really cheap, and there's also some cost in the permanent magnets. I machine these on my lathe, this solid shaft here, so there's quite a bit of setup time involved in that. There's cost in the bracket on the motor. I also have to build control boxes for it that are variable speed. There's quite a bit of cost involved in these. I'm not sure that people would be willing to spend almost as much just for this part as they would the entire jig. But if you have any thoughts on that, you can let me know. Whether you try to make your own, or if I get enough comments saying, hey, I want one of those too, I'd be willing to pay a price similar to, I mean, my jigs aren't cheap. They're $89. I think they're really, really good, and I think they're worth the money, but I'm not sure that people would be willing to spend that much on this. And I've already showed you how you can get a pretty good finish with epoxy without using one of these. This is faster, it's easier, but it's not necessary. So I'm not sure that people would be willing to spend the money on these. So I don't know if that would be a good move to buy up a bunch of components and start putting these things together. But if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. If you could leave me some comments down there. If there's enough demand, I'll look at doing that. If there's not, if it doesn't seem like people are that interested, then I probably won't bother with it. All right, we can see my rod dryer. Now, if you're using a rod dryer, you'll probably want to leave this slip clutch chuck tightened up. And the reason for that is you don't want to walk away from your dryer and find out that your slip clutch chuck was slipping. If you need it to reverse direction for whatever reason, you can actually grab a hold of this and get it to, if you get enough pressure on it, it'll stop and start spinning the other direction. Or you can unplug it and plug it in until it starts spinning the way you want to. Eventually it'll hit a point where it'll lock up and it'll reverse directions. That's how that works. Now this is a little different, and I think this is probably the handiest thing I've got at the moment, because it allows me to apply finish and use this baby bottle chuck as a slip clutch. I can stop and I can adjust the pressure on that, which is real nice. With this, I can do some power wrapping using it with my jig if I want to, and the 200 RPMs is enough to allow you to put a wrap down pretty fast. And let me just show you real quick how this works. I think y'all are going to like this. Now I can start this wrap by hand using that slip clutch chuck. Hopefully I got the tension set about right on it. It takes a little experimentation to figure out what kind of tension you need to use with it, but I'll see if I can get this wrap started here by hand and get a few turns on it. Now, for most people building a rod, they don't really need a motorized wrapper. I'm not saying it's not nice to have it. I'm just saying it's not necessary. I actually prefer wrapping by hand a lot of the times, most of the time. But this gives you an option if you're doing a really long wrap to do something a little different. I've got that started well enough here. I'm not going to try to make this pretty or anything. I'm just going to do this quickly. So you can see that'll pretty quickly put that wrap on there. And again, I wasn't being careful when I started it. You'd want to take your time to make sure you get this at the right angle here. If you get too much of an angle, it'll start rolling back over the top of itself. But you can see that's a lot faster than I can do that by hand because it's spinning at 200 RPMs. That's faster than I can spin it by hand. And as you need to, you can move it over just a little as your wrap continues on. If you move it too far, you'll get a gap like that, and you don't want that. So if that happens, you can always hit this switch here. I've got a switch that will allow forward and reverse. I'm going to back that off some. I'm going to do this slowly using that adjustable speed because you can see my tension rod coming in up. So I want to make sure that I move this spool as that tension rod's coming up. Let's speed that up a little here. So now I've backed up to where my mistake was, and I can adjust my position, turn it back to forward, and take off again from there and continue my wrap. So you can do a really long under wrap if you're building stuff like ocean rods and things that use really long under wraps. A power wrap feature is very handy. That's a lot faster than I can do that by hand. If you're just doing guide wraps on normal freshwater rods or even inshore rods or smaller, lighter weight saltwater rods, you really don't need that. But if you're building really big rods that have a lot of under wraps to protect the blank and things, using a power wrapper at that point makes a lot of sense. Or if you're doing production work, a power wrapper makes a lot of sense. If you're a hobbyist and you're building mostly smaller rods that aren't extreme duty rods, it's just not necessary. But there are occasions. One would be when I was doing the reel seat, where I wrapped the whole length of that aluminum tube to make a reel seat. That's where something like a power wrapper of some sort, at that point I hooked it up to my dryer motor because it turned slower and I didn't want it going too fast with that metallic thread. But for regular thread, you can go really as fast as you want to. You can go faster than the 200 RPMs I have on this DC motor. Really quickly you can do long wraps without a lot of effort. And that's something, again, I don't know that people would really be interested in that if they're buying my hand wrappers, but it's something that I could do at some point if there's enough interest in that. If you want to build one of these yourself, you're going to have to come up with a controller box of some sort. And let me show you how the electronics work on this. I'm using in this box what's called a pulse width modulator. And what it does is allow you to use a wide speed range without losing any torque. And these little gear motors like this one do put out quite a bit of torque. They've got a lot of oomph to them for their size. They're fairly quiet and they do a good job for what they're built for. And I'm going to take this controller box apart here and show you this little pulse width modulator. And I've got I believe it's called a double pull, double throw switch, which allows you to do forward, neutral, and reverse. Neutral will be off and reverse on your speed, on your motor direction. Most power wrappers won't have a reversible motor on them. And in fact, all the commercially available ones I know of don't have reversible motors. But it does come in handy sometimes if you've got it. But that little controller right there is what does all my speed control. And the way it works is I've got forward here, then there's a little potentiometer. It's got a click off and on. And you'll see a little light come on when it's on. You can barely see it through this little cover here. But you can turn it at really slow speeds. And I can get this down to about 20 RPMs. Now, and it'll run consistently at about 20-ish RPMs, about 1/10 of its normal speed output. Where that comes in handy is after you've applied at a high rate of speed your epoxy, before you get ready to put that rod on the dryer motor, you can slow it down and take a look at it and see what it's going to look like when you do put it on your dryer. And that's a handy thing to have that you won't get. You're not able to spin most of those foot pedal controlled motors that you see on the power wrappers. You won't be able to spin them this slow for any length of time because for one thing, you're doing it with your foot. And for another thing, those motors aren't really built to spin this slowly. This pulse width modulator works with DC motors instead of the AC that you'll usually find on the rod wrappers. This little DC motor doesn't use a lot of electricity. I think it draws about 0.5 amp or so. And this pulse width modulator does something interesting to control the speed to keep it from losing all of its torque when it's going this slow. Normally what you do on a motor that's a DC motor is you cut the voltage to slow it down. If you do that, you lose the torque. These little pulse width modulators, what they do instead of cutting the voltage is they pulse the voltage. So this is a 12 volt motor. I've got a 12 volt power adapter running to the pulse width modulator. it uses a signal from this potentiometer depending on where I have it positioned to control the speed. So that signal goes through this board and directs the circuitry on this board, the controller on this board, to pulse that full 12 volts. So if you're running at full speed, it's continuous 12 volts. If you reduce the speed in half to say 100 RPMs, it's running that 12 volts for half the time, but it's doing it in really fast pulses. So instead of actually cutting your power voltage coming into here, you're decreasing the frequency that voltage hits this motor, which slows it down without losing a lot of torque. So I can turn this at 20 RPMs or so and get it at a pretty low rate of speed consistently without it stopping on me. Now, if you get it too slow, let me slow it really slow down here, almost to the speed of a dryer motor. As slow as it's turning right now, you can stop it with your fingers and it won't start again unless you increase your voltage pulse to the motor. So I hope that made sense to y'all a little bit about the explanation of the way this works. These little motors are probably somewhere in the range of $15, and you can get the brackets for a couple of dollars. And these little controllers are somewhere around $10 usually, and that's why I don't know that I could sell all this together as a package for the price that I'd have to charge for it and actually be able to sell enough of them to justify making them available. I just don't know. I'm not sure that people want to spend $90 for these. This is how you can make your own if you want to. It requires a little work. I've soldered the wiring. I built the box that all this sets on to get it up to the level it needs to be, and I built the control box. I mean, I've got several hours tied up into this one because it was a one-off build. If I were doing something to sell, I could reduce that time somewhat, but I'd still have a lot of costs in the materials that go into it. The only thing about that pulse width modulator is you got to make sure your incoming voltage is wired correctly, positive to negative, or you'll fry the board. So there's some electrical wiring, there's cords to buy for it. The way I've got mine set up is I've got two cords that run from this. I've got a cord that runs off of the motor itself, and I've got a long length of cord on it, several feet. That way if I'm working on a 10-foot long rod, I can have this at the back of the rod and run this control box all the way up to the front where I'm working on the table. That way I can control my speeds and my on and off right there where I'm working. Then coming out of this controller box is a power adapter that plugs into the wall. So you're using wall outlet power, and it converts that AC coming in from your wall to a 12 volt DC output. And that runs into the speed controller. Then there's wires that come from the speed controller into the switches that control your reverse and forward on the switch here. And then those wires go back into the speed controller and out to this output here. So all it's doing to change your direction is flipping internally in the board itself, not the power coming into it, but in the board itself, it's flipping the positive and negative output. That's how you reverse a DC motor, is by changing the output voltage. What's coming in positive on one side and negative on the other will turn it one way. You reverse that and it spins the other way. So this switch is reversing the power that's coming off of that board, one direction or another. So there's quite a bit involved in putting one of these together. I've done a lot of work like that, so I'm familiar with how it works. If you're new to all that stuff, there's a little bit of a learning curve there that will take you some time to figure things out. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about it. If you want to try to put together one yourself, you can leave some comments down below, and I'll try to answer those questions for you if I can. And of course, you're going to want a dryer motor of some sort if you're building more than just one rod. If you're building a rod here or there, maybe one a year, you can get by without a dryer motor. You can get by without a finishing motor. If you're like me and you're working on things quite a bit, every week pretty much, doing some things with rod building, then these things are worth the time to either build yourself, or you can buy commercially available units. Don't know that there's anything quite like this one out there. Power wrapper is not the same as this. This is a different animal to me, in my opinion. On a power wrapper, you can do some light duty things like turning cork and things. This isn't for that. You can use it to do a wrap if you want to. You can use it mostly for finishing would be what I use mine the most for. And you can slow it down quite a bit too if you need to, the way I was showing you with the speed controller before you switch it over. It's just a unique setup, and the only ones like this that I would be thinking that might be out there are ones that other people built for themselves. And I don't even know how many of those are because I don't see a lot about that online. So I hope this video might be useful to y'all. I hope it might help you see a few things that you'll want to look for as you're looking at things to buy. Hopefully it didn't cause more confusion than it did helping people out. If you do have any questions, always feel free to ask me. You can leave comments below. I'll try to answer them there. I really appreciate all y'all checking it out. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will talk to you guys later.